Okay, so Oakland, California has announced its official framework for guaranteed income pilot. I've done a lot of research into this because this is a very loaded thing where you'll get different answers from different articles depending on what narrative they want to push. I'll say I find it rather surprising that conservative outlets aren't even picking it up at all. And I think it's because they don't want to talk about the positives of, some form of basic income program or guaranteed income program, because there are positives. But let's focus on the Oakland, California one. So basically, Oakland, California, they're implementing a guaranteed income program of $500 a month for at least 18 months. It's no strings attached, which means like it doesn't matter if you're employed or not. It's kind of the whole point of some form of income program. I'm a big UBI guy. The thing is, though, is that if you don't identify as a BIPOC individual, which is a Black, Indigenous, or a person of color, you don't have access to it, which means if you're white, you don't get any access to this guaranteed income program. It's an anti-white income program, right? Which makes it even more interesting is that illegal immigrants are allowed to have access to this, right? Undocumented workers have access to this program, but white people don't, which is really bizarre to me, right? For context, it's a lottery of only 600 families. And I just find it crazy. And the whole point is to offset systemic racism, right? I guess they decided that the best way to reduce systemic racism for BIPOC people was to implement it for white people. Now, apparently this is privately funded, though the mayor is in support of this, which is very bizarre. And it all comes off the back of like the average incomes of particular groups in that area, right? So white people in the area have an average or median income of $110,000 a year. Asians have one of $76,000 a year, Latinos 65, and Black people 37.5. Now, apparently, the white median income has been driven up by a lot of people, and I think the Asian one as well, moving to Oakland or moving to the area for tech jobs that are, I guess, gentrifying the area, which is creating more problems, which I find rather interesting that, like, wealthy white people are moving to the area and then, basically gentrifying it and kind of fucking the area up worse. I think the biggest problem I have with this is if you're trying to fight systemic racism of Black people, why are you including Asians and Latinos and undocumented workers? Honestly, if you really think about it, I'm somebody who comes from the perspective that Black people have a very unique issue in America. So if you're like, hey, we're only going to allow this lottery for only Black people, maybe I would be okay with it. I'd be like, okay, that makes sense. Their median income is $37,500. But theoretically, you're including Asians and Latinos, which means that, like, theoretically, since there's I think the population of that area is like 430,000, right? And then, like, let's say people below the poverty line is like half that. So, like, theoretically, not a single Black family can have access to this. It makes no sense. If Black people are suffering the most, then why would you offer access of this to Asians and Latino people? It makes no sense. Because apparently this comes from, like, the Black Panthers in the area. They wanted to implement, like, a UBI only for Black people. So, and this is something that if you take anything away from this is like a big thing, is that oftentimes we end up erasing the issues of Black people when we put them together with all other minority groups. It actually ends up fucking Black people's issues up. If this is meant to help Black people due to systemic racism, why are you including anybody else at all? Instead, they're excluding white people and including undocumented workers, right? Which means that this is a virtue signal. This isn't actually something for Black people. This is a virtue signal. This is an anti-white progressive virtue signal because it hits all the marks. Anti-white, pro-illegal immigration, erasure of Black issues, pure performance, right? This is performance-based, and a lot of times Black people tend to, like, not win when it comes to performance things. That's why I think it was Ice Cube was talking about working with Donald Trump to reverse the, like, to implement, I forget what it was called, America or something, some program for, like, Black people, right? Anyway, to move on from that, I would have pretty much stopped there. But to move on from that, in order to be eligible, there's two different eligibility. So half of the 600 is families below with with a household income below 59,000, the other half below 30,000, and of course you can't be white. Even if you match the poverty standards, you cannot be white. The platinum plan is what it's called. Okay, the platinum plan. Right? What I will say here though is that, and this is kind of where it gets to like my really biggest issue is that first and foremost, systemic racism existed at one point, but it no longer exists, right? I would say that it's now the lingering impacts of systemic racism having a negative impact on black people and making them disproportionately poor, right? And we would convert that to systemic oppression, which everybody can have. If you think that there's a class issue in America, which a lot of people do, especially progressives, you've seen all these commies out here. And by that logic, white people are victims of systemic oppression, just not proportionately to their population. You would say that poor people are victims of systemic oppression, right? And the way that we gauge this is by outcomes, right? If you have a poor outcome, then you're, by that logic, a victim of some form of oppression. But if you have a good outcome, then you aren't negatively impacted by systemic oppression, right? And I think that's something that we need to understand. But the biggest thing that I want to say is this. When it comes to being poor, it doesn't really matter why. From the perspective of a person being born into poverty, right? If you're a kid, I would ask you a very simple question. Do you get to choose what family you're born into? And the very simple answer is no. So let's say you're a black kid born into a black family, and the reason your family's poor is because they're black. Maybe, probably. Now let's say you're a white person and you were born into a poor family. Obviously, your skin color probably isn't the reason you're poor, but it could be a myriad of other things. It could be a history of mental health issues. It could be, your father, I don't know, your mother could have you could have seen an erasure of jobs in your parents due to low-skilled labor being phased out due to automation and increased minimum wage. I don't know. There's 100 different reasons, but at the end of the day, if you're born into poverty, regardless of your skin color, you have a higher chance of having a shitty school, increased violence, lack of job opportunities, and lack of like a healthy local economy. So you're going to be disadvantaged regardless of your skin color if you're poor. So it makes very little sense to me that you would tell white people who had no control over being born into poverty that they should be excluded from this program, because there's multiple forms of oppression. And the way that you actually gauge that oppression is based on the outcomes. Based on what was your outcome. So if you have a positive outcome, that means that you don't need access to this. If you have a negative outcome, it means you need access to it. Makes no sense to exclude white people specifically and only. It doesn't matter that the white median income is higher. That just means that there's going to be a lower population of poor white people. But why would you count that lower population of white people out? If anything, the way that you should have run this is because what they're doing is a lottery. It's like, hey, if you fall below this poverty line, we put you in a lottery. So there's probably 100,000 people put into this lottery, and 600 are going to win. 600. You're better off just picking the lowest earning 600 families. Doesn't that make the most sense? And you know what? They're probably all black, but it doesn't matter because we're not focusing on their race anymore. We're focusing on the poverty of it. And that's the thing. It's like nobody cares. No white person cares that black people are getting these things. It's when you specifically exclude white people, right? You could have literally just took the bottom 600 families and there probably wouldn't be a single white family in there and everybody would have been happy. But they didn't do that. They picked the most divisive way to go about this. And what I kind of want to end off with this is something I want you guys to understand is that this, like I said, is privately funded. But it seems to be privately funded heavily by rich white people who have moved to the area and other philanthropists. And so to me, and maybe I'm being a little too woke or maybe I'm being a little too conspiracy-ish, is that what it seems like to me is that rich white people who have historically in America been the actual oppressors are trying to express their white guilt and trying to repent for their white guilt by shitting on poor white people. That makes sense, right? Because think about it. Back in the day, who were the ones who bought slaves into America? It was rich white people, right? And then, apparently, there's this very unique thing in America called chattel slavery, where we actually not just enslaved black people, but we enslaved their entire lineage moving forward, right? Now, I don't know if that's unique to America. That's what I heard. It could be right, could be wrong. I don't know. Sounds like it could be right. I know other countries have class systems, but let's just focus on this, right? So we apparently had a very unique form of slavery. But how did we do that? Well, rich white people brought black people to America as slaves and then dehumanized them and then manipulated everybody else into thinking that black people were inferior, right? And then which apparently didn't work long term, because then white people were ultimately the ones to free slaves, right? Like, if you really, I mean, like, there would be no way that black people could have freed themselves, right? My point is that it seems like rich white people who have historically been the shittiest part of America are now shitting on white people to repent for their sins. But it's a virtue signal because they're doing it through donated money. It's not like they're advocating for their taxes to go up to redistribute wealth for every poor person in there. No. It's they're giving the amount of money they feel comfortable with giving out to promote this virtue signal so that they can seem like they actually give a fuck about poor black people when they don't. They don't give a shit. Because if they truly did, it would just be for black people. And at the end of the day, if this program was only for poor black people, I'd be fine with it. But realistically, it should be for the lowest 600 families, not some fucking bullshit lottery. So that's the conclusion that I've gotten from this whole entire thing. It's a loaded thing. It's a lot going on, but California can frankly go fuck itself. The fact that the mayor is like supporting this program blows my mind. Hey everyone, if you liked that video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And don't forget to follow my Twitch, Instagram, Twitter, Discord, and TikTok. All links are in the description. Also, check out my Patreon if you'd like to support me even more than you already do. Thank you so much, everyone. I love you all.